So I wanted to begin tonight with an exercise. If I can ask everybody to close your eyes for a second, like actually. And I want you to picture a deafening, piercing smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. I want you to picture how you'd feel, how you'd react hearing it. You can open your eyes again. The reason I bring this up is because that is verbatim how a United Nations official described last year's report coming out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, the IPCC is not a body that's typically known for its dramatic pronouncements. It's a bunch of technocrats. What they do is bar graphs, but this was the quote, that it was a deafening, piercing smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. But we all know this, right? We know already that man-made climate change is arguably the greatest ever threat to human civilization, not to mention our species. Like, the reason that alarm is going off is because the house we all live in together has already started to burn. And that is shocking, but it's also somehow one of the most mundane of truisms, right? We've all heard that 1,000 times. And there are a lot of brave and intelligent people who've already spoken at length about how we tackle that problem in terms of policy and politics. And those conversations are incredibly important, but they are not what I want to talk about tonight. Tonight I want to talk about something much simpler, which is how does it feel emotionally to be living under climate change, to be living in hazy earshot of that deafening smoke alarm? And I want to show you that this is actually a vitally important question, right? Because it's not a good cocktail party conversation. It is not going to come up over dinner. You're probably not going to chat about it at the office. Because it's hard to talk about our feelings, and it's doubly hard, I think, to talk honestly about climate change. So tonight, I'm going to try to do us the favor of going first in the hopes that that can open up a wider conversation. So for the past 5 years, I have run campaigns in New York City and state to pass ambitious climate policies. So I've met with senators, I've rallied outside their offices, I've stayed up all night drafting press releases. I thought every day about climate change. I wrote its name in emails. I said the words climate change on conference calls at least 9 times a day. And I'll be the first to admit that most of the time, the only thing I felt was numb. And I suspect I'm not the only person. I think probably some of us have been to a party where somebody's made the faux pas of bringing up climate change. And usually the conversation's like full steam in the other direction. Or the other move is to make some sort of dark joke about it. Like, climate change, man, like, that's not really. Do you feel how cold it was today? And as the climate guy in my circles in the States, I get that joke literally all the time. And I've come to think that it maybe serves a deeper role than simply sidestepping a conversation that nobody's trying to have at a party. I think that irony and dark humor and weary cynicism, that whole package of reactions, serves maybe to mask this deeper, more embarrassing reality. And that is not our raw emotions of fear and sadness about the problem, but precisely our lack thereof. The way that few of us seem to be able to muster an emotional response that feels commensurate to the scale and the gravity of that problem we are actually facing. It's this embarrassing numbness, in other words, this feeling when you look at the trend lines on paper, like, why isn't everybody freaking out more? Why aren't I freaking out more? And I want to suggest that that's actually not that surprising. In the past half century, we've been thrust into this new world where all the most consequential currencies, things like data, carbon, capital, are circulating around the globe in networks of impossible speed and complexity. And we're all entangled in those networks and being asked to process more and more information every day. And you can just look at the list of push notifications that I guarantee are accumulating in all of your pockets as we speak to be reminded of this. And so what do we do with all that information? Well, the common frame is that we try to wrap our heads around it, right? As in wrapping our heads around Brexit or blockchain or coral bleaching. But often absent from those conversations is any mention of that old foil to the head, which is, of course, the heart. Rarely do we ask it to wrap around anything. The heart wants what it wants, as the saying. It just feels what it feels. And so unlike the head, the heart is thought of as this static object, the same throughout history, easily outpaced by current events. Which is maybe why, in a moment when climate change is placing us at the ends of increasingly vast and twisty causal chains, when taking a flight from Sydney to London can affect crop yields in Sudan, or when voting for coal expansion in one country can cause coastal flooding in the next, in Mozambique, for example, which happened today, that our ethics have frankly struggled to keep up. And it's also maybe the reason why a lot of intelligent people describe this feeling like they're sleepwalking when it comes to climate change, right? Like they cannot wake up to the full reality of it. And here's my main contention, that sleepwalking is not a viable mode for the 21st century. Like if we're being honest with ourselves, things are likely to get worse before they get better. And if we can't process that, if we aren't ever able to mourn, then we're going to get blindsided. Because if we continue to keep climate change emotionally compartmentalized, then eventually, and it may not be that far in the future, there's going to be some migration crisis or water shortage or superstorm that is going to break through that compartment by force, and we won't have been ready. And you can ask any psychologist, numbness is never a healthy response to trauma, and emotional avoidance rarely solves problems, it deepens them. So we are going to have to figure out a way to access our grief about climate change, to wrap our hearts around it, in other words. And this is not to say that we give in to despair, quite the opposite. Emotional processing is going to make us braver, more resilient, more able to cope and to act. Like I truly believe that accessing our grief about climate change is going to be one of the keys to our survival in the coming centuries. But you don't have to take it from me. Last year, there was a major study published in the journal Nature Climate Change from two psychological researchers, one from the University of Western Australia, actually, and the other from the University of Newfoundland. And they came to two primary conclusions. First, that from a psychological point of view, grief is an incredibly important response to the facts of climate change. And second, that at least with things as they currently stand, we have almost no avenues for the expression of that kind of grief. They've even come up with a word for it. The term is solastalgia, a type of grief over the loss of a healthy place or a thriving ecosystem. And their contention is that solastalgia probably exists in some form in all of us. We just have not figured out a way to make space for it yet. Now, one thing that actually gives me hope in all of this is climate denial. And what I love about climate denial is that it's usually the right accusing the left of being too emotional about the environment, right? Because we're always hugging trees and we're singing Kumbaya around the campfire and we're sobbing over polar bears or whatever it is that we do. But this is an incredibly hypocritical position, right? Because what could be a more emotional response to climate change than this? You know, like this kid is pretending not to hear what he's being told. And he's trying to make us believe that he doesn't hear it, but I don't know if I totally buy it. And if climate change is able to elicit this strength of an emotional reaction, even amongst that segment of the population that's least likely to tackle it, then surely something must be bubbling under the surface for each of us in this room tonight. So how do we get there? How do we access that? And this is the main question motivating my Fulbright project. This is why I came to Australia. I think there came a point in my activism in the States where I realized that if I was never able to process my emotions about climate change, then I would not be able, physically and emotionally, to continue the work in the climate movement for the rest of my life, which is what I plan to do. And so I came here to explore what it would mean to accommodate the full weight of the thing, right? To trace the precise contours of my own numbness and try to find a way into it. And there are two primary ways that I'm trying to do this. The first is by engaging with Aboriginal art of country. And it's a fact often cited in Australia, I've heard it lots of times, that Aboriginal culture is the oldest continuous culture on the planet, 60,000 years old, give or take. And to give you a sense of how truly old that is, just 15,000 years ago, my home of New York City was literally buried under 3 kilometers of ice, which also makes Aboriginal culture one of the only cultures on the planet to have already survived a major climatic change more or less intact. And to me, it's no coincidence that this culture of unprecedented resilience is grounded in a deeply emotional connection to country. You know, this feeling of inextricability from the land and its changes. So in July, I will be headed up to Broome, Australia, to walk the Lurajari Heritage Trail, which is a songline that runs 80 kilometers north of Broome, with some elders from the Gulurabulu clan, to learn from them about how these kinds of emotive stories can connect a community to its country by the heart, and how those stories might be changing as the landscape undergirding them is transformed by climate change. But the other thing I'm doing is simply writing letters. That is literally how I spend most of my time here in Adelaide, is I just sit in my office and write letters. And they're not to my parents or to my friends back home, but to somebody who doesn't exist yet and may never exist. The person I'm writing to is my hypothetical future child, the one that I haven't decided whether to have yet. And this, for me, taps the ultimate emotional vein, the fact that I would so love to be a father, but that the facts of climate change, such as they are, make me question whether that's a wise decision or not. Now, probably the cushion of middle-class global north privilege will mean that her life is not foreshortened, but do I want to bring a kid into a world where the headlines might keep getting worse for a while? Like, I truly don't know the answer to that question, but it's a conversation I'm trying to have with her and with myself by writing these letters. And since I've started writing them, something big has happened for me personally, actually, which is that for the first time in my life, I've started sometimes to cry about climate change. Never a lot, and rarely in public, but there's something about writing these letters that has opened this little window of lucidity for me, where that gap between the fact and the feeling is momentarily closed. And it feels like I can accommodate the full weight of the thing, like I'm wrapping my heart around it for a second. And I've come to weirdly treasure those moments, because yes, they feel like mourning, but they also feel good, they feel accurate. They feel like I'm no longer sleepwalking. And I'm not saying that all of you should go home and start writing to your non-existent progeny. I don't think what works for me is necessarily going to work for all of you. All I'm saying is that I really think we need to start having these conversations. Over the dinner table, in bed with your partner, just with yourself. Climate change is scary and it's sad, but if we figure out a way to actually feel those things, then it might be a little less so. Which is to say that grief may be key to finding a kind of grace in a warming world, literal grace under fire. And just to be real for a second, I know that after this talk is done, all of us, and I include myself in this, are going to compartmentalize it and get on with our days, right? We're going to go home, we're going to log into Netflix, we're going to walk the dog. Life is going to move on, in other words, which is all it can ever do. And that's fine, because we cannot live in constant grief any more than we can live in constant joy. But when you do feel something, some shimmer of a feeling about climate change, don't turn away from it. Just see if you can sit with it for a second. See if you can give it space. That may well be the most important affective task of the 21st century. And I think that we're up for it. Thank you.